Welcome to the Battery Testing Mentor podcast, the podcast about battery testing, battery safety, and battery handling. My name is Johannes, and here we dive into one topic every 2 weeks and dissect it and try to learn and take learnings back home. If you have any ideas about topics or any other feedback, feel free to reach out to me via LinkedIn, email, wherever you can find me. If you sign up for the email update, you also get the email every 2 weeks before the release of the episode with a short summary. Then you can just hit reply and you directly reach me. Also, if you want to get in touch with our guest, Michael Becker, where we continued the video, just reach out to me and I put you into contact. As I said, we continued the interview. We started last week, 2 weeks ago. I still need to get along with this 2 weeks schedule. We had started this interview. Today we continue and I am very excited. It is super interesting and I wish you a lot of fun listening to Michael Becker. Yeah. This is a good keyword, this standardization. I mean, to switch a little bit the focus, you are or have a lot of insights into this whole standards and regulation world. Do you have a feeling about, like, is it enough regulation that we have? Are there areas that are maybe overregulated? Are there areas that are lacking regulation and standardization? Can you share there a little bit here, like kind of your gut feelings? Is there some, for example, industry that is at the moment somehow sailing under the radar and is not affected by this?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think from CSA's perspective, we don't get too involved in regulation and whether there should be more regulation or less regulation. Our responsibility is really to provide the standards, one, to meet the regulation, but then also perform the testing and certification to the different regulations. Now, what we do is, we try to understand what the regulations are because it's important for us to know
Mm.
how regulations are changing, right? So one, looking at the codes in North America, like NFPA versus the EU battery regulation, right? How do those
Mm.
compare to each other? What's the impacts of those that they're going to have? And then understanding what standardization needs to take place or is taking place, whether we get involved in it, whether we initiate it, or whether we're a part of it, so that when these standards come out, we know how to provide the services for them. So that's
Mm.
kind of where more our involvement is, and not really, I guess, more on the regulation side and the legislation. We don't get too involved in that side.
Yeah. Is there, like, when you brought up the point EU battery regulation, this is here in Europe, it is of course a big topic.
Yeah.
It's directly affecting companies here.
Hmm.
And at the same time, it is not really involving a lot of testing. I mean, or at least not directly.
Hmm.
But it's more like a lot of kind of paperwork you need to do.
Hmm.
Do you see that this is an area that might also then, get into other markets, maybe reach one day also North America, kind of with this whole like sustainable thoughts and kind of guaranteeing to the customer certain aspects that are comparable, basically?
Hmm. Yeah, so I guess starting on the first part of that question,
Mm.
for the EU battery regulation, I think there probably will end up being testing and standardization around testing. I think
Yeah.
especially for energy storage systems, right? We have
Mm.
the
There
Article
are some
12, I believe, in
tests.
the
Yeah.
Annex 5
Mm.
on the test, and actually some recent information that I gathered. So, part of that activity then was to initiate a standardization process where new standards are being developed. So there's actually new standards being worked on currently that will then be used to fulfill the requirements of the regulation that will be considered the harmonized standards. And so they
Mm.
did look at the EU Commission did look at UL 1973, UL 9540, 9540A, IEC 62619. So they looked at existing standards and didn't find standards that they felt could just be adopted as is. So they're actually working on new standards that would then be used as the harmonized standards to point to for testing. So I do think once those start coming out, you'll have a little bit clearer pathway of what tests need to be performed on what types of products for batteries. So I think that will initiate and cause more testing to be done than maybe what's currently defined in the regulation. But I do think in other regions, there's also standards being developed. So at least in North America, there's standards being developed looking at the circularity and the supply chain.
Mm,
So I think you're right in that across the board, I think you're going to start looking at one testing, safety testing will be a big element regardless of where you're at. And then regardless of where you're at as well, I think elements of supply chain, circularity, recyclability, reusability,
mm,
those elements will also be used across different regions.
yeah. So you are probably with CSA also very active in involving in standardization meetings, discussions, shaping test standards.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, how do you kind of bring in a perspective that is then also like not just the old kind of testing body basically,
Hmm.
but really stays on top of the current developments? I guess
Yeah.
I mean this is what I feel is kind of always a challenge when you're not really involved in the design of batteries and kind of
Yeah.
but more on the testing side.
No, that's a good question. I think it's like you said, it's something that could be a challenge for sure
Mm,
for companies like CSA. I think what we've done more recently in the last few years to help with that is one, it's have the right talent and the right people at CSA. So there's people like myself and others on our team that we come from industry.
mm,
So we did not come from a testing and
yeah.
certification background, but we come from industry and innovation and development. So we have a lot of those types of people at CSA Group who came from more of a development side, who are, who keep up to date on latest developments. And I think too, it's important, and that's where we almost have a partnership with a lot of our clients, is that they also help us understand, what new developments like they're working on
Mm,
and what's coming down, but then we also help them understand what new standards development and regulation. And so it's kind of a mutually, beneficial education where it's good for us to understand that from the technology side. They understand it more from the standard side because we have that background. And then that helps us when we go into standards development, technical committee meetings. We take that input and we
mm,
share that with our customers. This is what's being discussed. This is what's being talked about. Like, do you have any input? How will this impact you? And then they can also help us on the other side. And so, yes, we look at it from the perspective of CSA and being a testing body, but I think we have a lot of people at CSA who think a little bit differently, have the background in development, and then we also leverage our customers' expertise a lot because they want
mm,
to be involved too, but they
yeah.
may not have a pathway to be involved.
Mm,
But then us involving them really helps us because then we understand what their concerns are, but then they'll also be
mm,
able to have a voice in the development.
yeah. Yeah. Now, when looking at this kind of global development of standards, one thing that recently made a lot of kind of social media buzz was the new GB standard for electric cars in China that kind
Hmm.
of comes with this no propagation at all, basically requirement.
Hmm.
Now, I mean, at the moment, kind of it is only, I think, getting into force next year. It's kind of only China. Um, but do you see there kind of the that it will spread around the world and that it might also spread kind of into stationary batteries, into
Hmm.
other applications? Because this GB standard is only
Yeah.
applicable for electric vehicles, right? So, but kind of the question is if you have then the design figured out that there is really no propagation anymore,
Hmm.
um, won't it then be automatically kind of leaking into all the other applications and suddenly in some way maybe all the testings would also focus or change the focus.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think that viewpoint is kind of already the focus is already being a little bit adjusted for stationary storage, at least in North America. I say that because traditionally for 9540A, for let's say the module test, you would have to have cell to cell propagation. So what would happen is if you didn't have cell to cell propagation, you would either have to initiate multiple cells into thermal runaway, or you would have to remove, like, let's say you had a thermal barrier in between cells that would prevent propagation, you'd have to remove
Mm,
it. And so more recently, CSA actually, we developed a standard to evaluate thermal barriers, thermal barrier material to prevent propagation. And so
mm,
I think what we're looking at is instead of having to remove thermal barriers or having to have cell to cell propagation, is being able to take credit for those thermal barriers, evaluate them, make sure that they have the right construction,
mm,
and then you may not have any propagation, like you said. So you may
yeah.
have a single cell, you put it in the thermal runaway, you have no propagation. So I think it's kind of heading in that direction, but that's where when you start thinking of the large scale fire testing that we've done, that's where I think the focus is changing, where it's not, yes, you can have a single cell thermal runaway. If you have a design that prevents propagation, great, excellent, right? Like that helps the safety of the product. But that's just one element, right? If you have an external fire, or if you have a single cell and you have ignition of gases that cause the fire condition, now you need to understand how that is going to perform, which is going to be very different from just a single cell thermal runaway test. So I think even in stationary, you're starting to see a little bit change in focus to, yes, you want to evaluate the design of the product to make sure that it's safe, and having no propagation would do that. But now it's okay, even if there's no propagation, what's the fire performance of this type of product? Whether the
Mm,
fire comes from the cell or something else. So I
mm,
think I think that's starting to be, used for that, and that seems to be, at least for an electric vehicle, you kind of are going in that direction where if you have the no propagation, you still might have to look at an external fire test, right? Where you still have external fire and you see how it performs. So I think it's both areas, and the focus is going to be on both of those moving forward.
mm. Yeah. Generally, would you say there is kind of this conversion between the different markets in terms of standardization? I mean, normally you always say, okay, in America, you need to follow the UL standards.
Hmm.
In Europe, it's IEC, ISO, or then the harmonized standards of the European Union. China, it's GB. Um, and then all the other countries also have their own kind of standards. Do you think there will be a convergence that in at one point it might be really very, very similar, kind of the requirements between the countries, that you don't need to have special designs, for example?
Yeah, so I think it would be very difficult to get, I think, further down to that
Mm,
point. Um, I think, CSA as a company, we always strive to have global harmonization of standards. And
mm,
so even for Canada, a lot of times CSA will adopt like an IEC standard, maybe with some deviations, but adopts the IEC standard to, like you said, prevent the need to have a bunch of different designs or different requirements per regions. I think when you talk globally, there's a lot of different standards development associations involved in it, and they all, they don't all, um, I guess, report up to the same entity.
mm,
They're very different, right? So you have different entities in North America. In Europe, like you said, you have ISO, you have IEC, you have harmonized standards, you have Senelec and EN, and then in Asia, you also have different standards in Australia and India. So there's so many, different standards development organizations. I think it's hard to do that, but what I think it's where that comes from, where that push comes from, is the industry. And so if you have
mm,
the like same people from industry involved in all the different committees, which I think I see a lot in the battery world, where on the IEC and ISO committees, the same people are on the UL committees, the same people are on the other committees in other regions. That helps to, even though you might have a different standard, that helps to kind of standardize the requirements as much as possible. So I think that's probably the best that can happen right now is industry and people who are involved in committees is getting involved in multiple regions so that they can help, encourage similarity in the standards.
So basically, when we say it might come together, but it will never go really to the point that you have one requirement kind of all across the world. And if you fulfill this, then you can sell wherever. Um,
Hmm.
what would you say from your point of view? What is important when you want to follow now or enter the North American market? What should manufacturers be aware about
Hmm.
in terms of standardization requirements?
Yeah, I think the biggest difference and the biggest surprise, I think, to some companies who may not be familiar with North America is the requirement for third-party certification.
Hmm.
So in Europe, you have the CE marking, which in some cases you need a notified body, but in a lot of cases it can be a self-declaration. So there's some testing you need to perform, but you can kind of declare you meet the standard or the regulation or the directive.
Hmm.
In North America, you have standards like UL, CSA standards, and you have to get certification by a third party who's approved by OSHA to perform that certification. And
Hmm.
so there's not as many options for those companies. So CSA, we are a nationally recognized testing lab, and there are a few others for battery standards. But that's probably the biggest surprise, I think, to some European companies is that you have to get certification from a third party, which involves a little bit more process than a CE mark, as an example.
Hmm.
But I think the important thing is getting getting somebody like CSA involved early in the design process to understand one, what standards would apply to your type of product. So that's the first thing to understand. And then once you do, you can design your product to meet the standards, and that really helps minimize any type of longer timelines or failure of the test or to the standard later down the development process. So I think that's probably the most important thing is just involving somebody like CSA early. We can help, we can assist with
Hmm.
figuring out, what the standards are, how to approach them, and then, we would perform the certification and evaluation once the product is finished.
Yeah. Now you said in the beginning, or you were before also in the kind of on the manufacturer side. Now you are on kind of the testing side.
Hmm.
How would you say your view on the standards changed, or did it change?
I think, yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think when, in the end, so like CSA's goal is to help customers demonstrate compliance to the standard. So that's our end goal. When I'm on the manufacturing side, you have kind of different goals and different objectives, right? Like your objective is to get a product out to market as quickly and
Hmm.
efficiently as possible. And so I think when considering standards from that viewpoint, you're trying to figure out how to meet the standard. You don't want to bypass safety, you don't want to minimize safety, but it's how to do that in a way where the product cost is as low as possible. You can pass the testing as quickly as possible. The certification cost is competitive, and it's you can do it fast. You have good service. So I think there's the goals and the motives are a little bit different on each side, but I think one of the things that's a strength of CSA, at least we've made it a focus recently, is to understand the customer side and understand where they're coming from, so that you're not just a regulation body that says nope, you fail,
Hmm.
come back when you're ready. Like we are, we try to understand the motives and what our customers are going through, so that we can then help them demonstrate compliance to the standards and assist them, and not just kind of leave them to figure it out on their own. So I think having the perspective of coming from the manufacturer really helps. Like I said, a lot of the people at CSA come from industry. Then you understand what people in industry are going through and what their objectives
Hmm.
are, and it can really help you to have better conversations and give better
Hmm.
service. So I
Yeah.
think it definitely helps for sure if you have that viewpoint.
Hmm. Can you share some kind of common problems you encounter when you talk to manufacturers? What kind of they stumble over kind of again and again and again, and Yeah. Is there something that is very common?
Yeah, I think I would boil it down to a few common challenges that come up for certification. One is, like I said, it's good to get somebody like CSA involved early in the process.
Mm,
Sometimes what happens is they get us involved at the very end when the product is done and they need to go to market in a month or two. And it's
mm,
really hard to complete the certification process in that type of time frame. So that's one thing is kind of understanding the requirements, the standards, and getting us involved early. I think the other thing is understanding that what type of components and everything that you're sourcing for your product matters in certification. That also has a big impact. So again, it's if you involve us early, you can understand that so you don't get to the end and now we determine a specific component doesn't meet the standard and now you're kind of at the end and now you need to do a redesign to meet the standard. And I think the other challenge that we run into a lot is having the documentation for certification. So when you go through that process, there's a lot of documents that are needed from our side, like a bill of materials, like a schematic, like a product diagram, a specification sheet, an installation manual, a user manual. And so there's all these documents that we need that we're required to review, but we get to that point and maybe they're not ready or they don't have the
mm,
documentation readily available. And that also slows things down a lot. So I would say those are probably the major challenges. There's not, I would say, one major thing everybody fails or a requirement or a test that everybody fails. I think it's more of those process and documentation challenges that we run into, where again, that's why it's good to get us involved early because it helps mitigate those risks later on.
mm. Yeah, that was a very, very interesting discussion with you, conversation. I'm grateful you found the time. Is there anything else like we haven't touched yet that you would still like to share? Um,
I think the only other thing is also just helping helping the audience understand how they
mm,
can keep up to date with
yeah.
things that are happening in regulations and standards. It's not easy to do. I think what I've found recently is there's not one way to do it. So there's not a
Mm,
specific webinar you can sign up for or a newsletter you can sign up for to get all of the information that you need. I think we're going into a direction where there's a lot of different avenues of information. And so I always tell people to get involved in the technical committees, get involved in standards development as much as possible because that helps you stay, up to
mm,
date, gets your voice heard, gets you involved. And then also, joining joining industry associations, signing up for newsletters, signing up for podcasts like this one. I think all of those things
thank you
really
for
help
the
you get, as
advert.
much information as possible. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely a true point. Like, if there would be kind of one source where you can find everything and ideally get it like chewed up into digestible
hmm
pieces, would be great.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, I mean, I tried out also to play a little bit with ChatGPT on this.
hmm
But there's so much stuff coming out where you
Yeah.
say, I mean, if you know the standards, the regulations, you say it's wrong, and it's kind of you can't find the text there.
hmm
But I mean, yeah, if you are like don't are not aware what's certain in the standard, then
Yep.
you might easily fall for it.
It's
So
hard to keep up to date. Yeah, and even
yeah,
some of the standards development stuff that you may not only know about it if you're involved in the committee and
mm,
involved in the discussions, and then you don't find out until it comes out, and by then it's kind of late. So
yeah,
yeah, there's a lot of different ways I think to get involved and stay up to date, but it really requires a lot of effort to do that. That's why we try to do it as best as we can, and then we try to help our customers, know that
mm,
information so we don't keep it to ourselves. But there's a lot of ways to get all this information for sure.
yeah. Okay, thank you very much for your time. It
Yeah.
was great to have you here. And I mean, I would definitely hope to that we meet again here at the podcast in a year or two to see kind of how everything has developed then and how everything has changed. But so far, thank you very much.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you for having me again. Appreciate it.
That was the second part of the interview with Michael Becker. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you could take some learnings with you, something to take home and apply in your work. If you have any questions, any ideas, want to get in contact with Michael, feel free to reach out to me and I'll put you into contact, or you can also find Michael on LinkedIn directly. Have a good 2 weeks ahead and hear you soon.